This podcast is going to be part one of our discussion of ethics. And what we're going to do is look at a case and consider that case in terms of several different ethical theories. The case. Martha Schwartz is one of the most senior staff nurses in the neonatal intensive care unit. She works only part-time because of her own children. Baby Daniel Ingerman has coded, and Martha, with a recently graduated RN at her side, is quickly and efficiently working with a house doctor to resuscitate him. It is clear, however, that the baby's chances of surviving this episode are extremely slim, and that even if he lives, he will probably be severely handicapped both mentally and physically. As she is about to help with the medication, Martha glances through the window at Elaine and Don Ingerman, somberly watching the staff's frantic activity. At once, she realizes that she should be in two places at once. The parents need her. Their child is dying. She has worked with the Ingermans during the past 2 critical days and believes she could be of help to them. Now we're going to consider this case in terms of utilitarianism, deontological ethics, social justice, and in something I'm going to call the ethics of care in a different voice. The first ethical theory we're going to look at is utilitarianism, which was championed by John Stuart Mill. And I like to give you a little bit of background on these different people who created these ethical theories, just so you can kind of get a look at them. John Stuart Mill was born in London on May 20th, 1806, and he was the eldest son of James Mill. He was educated entirely by his father and was deliberately shielded from association with boys of his own age. From his earliest years, he was subjected to a rigid system of intellectual discipline. As a result of this system, according to his own account, he believed this gave him an advantage of a quarter of a century over his contemporaries. Mill recognized in later life that his father's system had the fault of appealing to the intellect only, and that the culture of his practical and emotional life had been neglected, while his physical health was probably undermined by the strenuous labor exacted from him. He was already coming to be looked upon as a leader of thought when, in his 21st year, a mental crisis occurred, which he described in his autobiography. This crisis was the result of the severe strain, physical and mental, to which he had been subjected from his earliest years. He was, quote, in a dull state of nerves. The objects of his life for which he had been trained and for which he had worked lost their charm. He had no delight in virtue or the general good, but also just as little in anything else. A constant habit of analysis had dried up the fountains of feeling within him. After many months of despair, he found accidentally that the capacity for emotion was not dead, and that the cloud gradually drew off. Sounds like depression to me. Another important factor in his life was a Mrs. Taylor, who co-authored many pieces with him. He maintained a close relationship with her for many years while she was married. When her husband died, Mill married her in 1851. His work in connection with the literary journals was enormous. He wrote articles, mostly without number, on endless variety of subjects: philosophy, politics, economics, and sociology. On Liberty, the one in which we're going to be discussing, was published in 1859. Now, utilitarianism begins as an ethical stance about the individual, but eventually lays the groundwork for ethics in society. And I'm going to look at that work chapter by chapter, and you'll find out that there are not that many chapters. In the introduction, Mills talks about the fact that the struggle of liberty and authority has been in existence since almost the beginning of time. In Greece, Rome, and England, authority in terms of tyranny was acceptable, since it was felt that rulers gained their powers from conquest, and because of being the fittest, they should have power over weaker members of their societies in order to protect them from being preyed upon by those with less than admirable reasons. However, as humans progressed, societies decided that rulers should be identified with their people, and that their interest should be the interest of the whole nation. However, the problem with this is that it became the tyranny of the majority. Mill spoke out about concerning this majority in his treatise on liberty, which we're going to be discussing. He believed in the ability of the government to rule, but that the government has its limits. He said the sole end for which mankind are warranted in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is to prevent harm to others. His good, either physical or moral, is not sufficient warrant. Over himself, over his own body, the individual is sovereign. In Chapter 2, Mills discussed about liberty of thought and discussion. He said the idea of government is being in line with the tyranny of the majority, and he sees two problems with this. If discussion about governments is silenced, then there is the assumption of infallibility, but that is never the case. He also said that if discussion is silenced, the beliefs held are dead dogma and not a living truth. Therefore, it is only by the collision of opinions that the whole truth of the matter is ever revealed. In Chapter 3, he talks about individuality as one of the elements of well-being. He said, man must be free to act on their opinions so long as it is at their own risk or peril. However, such liberty has its limits. Mills said that the liberty of the individual must be limited so he does not make a nuisance of himself to other people. But if he refrains from molesting others, he should be able to carry out his own opinions. Mills says it is important that we have freedom of thought and action, but there are limits, such as crying out fire in a crowded theater. The crux of his argument for having freedom of action and thought is important, since without these, mankind, he felt, would fall into mediocrity, and unknown truths would remain hidden. In Chapter 4, he talks about the limits to authority of society over the individual. He said how much of human life should be assigned to individuality and how much to society. That which is of interest to the person should be his own, but everyone who receives protection from society owes some return for the benefits. Mills said no one should be punished for being drunk, but a soldier or a policeman who is drunk on duty should be punished. In summary, Mills felt that there was a need for freedom of opinion, that there was the need for freedom of action, and that there was a limit to the authority of government. Now, you should be questioning this whole section, since it has to do with the individual and not the greatest good for the greatest number. Here's the kicker. Mills moved on from thinking about the individual to applying his tenets to all of society. Therefore, the mantra of the utilitarian is the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, what I want you to do is to copy the internet address from this slide and put it into your browser and watch Utilitarian Bonanza. I have, I think, 3 or 4 of these internet sites that I want you to go to, and I would embed them into the podcast, but I'm afraid things would get all screwed up and you wouldn't be able to see them. So just copy it, paste it into your browser, and enjoy. Now, resolution of the case using utilitarianism would be, all things considered, in maximizing the happiness of the most, Martha should go to the parents. On the pro side, if the baby lived, there would be great unhappiness because of his presumably mental and physical condition. The parents would get some comfort since the baby is probably going to die and they could begin the grieving process. The new nurse would get some valuable experience. On the con side, the doctor would lose assistance of a good nurse and the baby would not receive expert care. Therefore, we've got 3-2. So to maximize the happiness, Martha should go out to the parents. Well, you're going to find out that there are problems with each of these ethical stances that we're going to look at. And the problems with utilitarianism are several. There are problems in defining exactly what each act is supposed to maximize. Is attending to the parents maximizing emotional support, or is it providing information? And there are problems forecasting the consequences of possible courses of actions quickly and accurately enough to ground decisions on utilitarian considerations. Maybe the baby would have lived and been okay if Martha would have stayed in the room assisting the doctor, and that may have increased everyone's happiness. There are also problems in comparing happiness that a particular action would bring, since happiness in one person may not be the same as in another. Maybe the parents would have been happiest seeing that everything possible was done for their child, even if he subsequently died. Then there are implications of the principle. It may require punishment of the innocent. It may enslave or silence minorities. And you could even have widespread euthanasia of the elderly or the unfit. This is because utilitarianism is unable to account for the independent value of justice and individual rights. Now, over the years, as I've done this lecture, I've always felt that utilitarianism really didn't have much of a place in our considering ethical cases. However, I have had several people that have a military background, and it really seems to fit in their instances. So I've taken another look at this ethical principle. Now, if you are a duty-oriented person and tend to see things in black and white, then you may like deontological ethics as put forth by Immanuel Kant. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. Immanuel Kant was born in Königsberg, East Prussia, in 1724. He attended a collegium at the age of 8, which was a Latin school that taught primarily classicism. Over 8 years of study there, then he went on to the University of Königsberg, where he spent his academic career focusing on philosophy, mathematics, and physics. The death of his father had a strong effect on Kant. He left the university and earned a living as a private tutor. However, in 1755, he accepted the help of a friend and resumed study, receiving his doctorate in 1756. He taught at the university and remained there for 15 years, beginning his lectures on sciences and mathematics, though over time he covered most branches of philosophy. In spite of his growing reputation as an original thinker, he did not gain tenure at the university until 1770, receiving his professorship of logic and metaphysics. He continued writing and lecturing at Königsberg for the next 27 years, drawing many students there due to his rationalist and hence unorthodox approach to religious texts. This led to political pressure from the government of Prussia, and in 1792 he was barred from teaching or writing on religious subjects by the king, Frederick William II. Kant dutifully obeyed the injunction until the death of the king 5 years later, returning to the writing and lecturing of his ideas. The year following his retirement, he published a summary of his views on religion, and he died in 1804. Now we're going to look at deontological or duty-based ethics. And kind of a snapshot of this is the sole feature that gives an action moral worth is not the outcome that is achieved by the action, but the motive behind the action. So we have to start from the beginning. Kant says that every man has freedom to act. If we did not have freedom to act, there would be no moral dilemmas. Now, what I want you to do is take out a sheet of paper, and I want you to draw a series of little arrows all in a line on that piece of paper. What that is going to show is predetermination of cause and effect. One thing causes another, and there is no choices that have to be made. Then what I want you to do is draw a little curved arrow, let's say at the middle of your little line of arrows, that's pointing downward. What this means is there is a choice point. You have to do some thinking. It means that there really is no predetermination of cause and effect, and that this point is where ethical dilemmas occur. With that being said, Kant stated that there are two classes of beings for whom moral action is not an issue. One is animals, since they act only according to instinct and are subject to cause and effect or causal determination. If the dog is hungry, he will fight for food, no matter the ethics of eating, while some other dog dies from lack of sustenance. The other class is that of God, who is a purely rational being and does not need to determine if the correct thing is done. It always is. But humans lie somewhere in between the animals and God, so that they need a set of rules to guide their decision-making at that little downward arrow point. This is where goodwill comes into play. Since when we act, whether or not what we intend with our actions is often beyond our control, the morality of our actions cannot depend on the outcomes, only the will behind the action. In other words, the goodwill. The morality of an action must be assessed in terms of the motivation behind it. For Kant, it must be done out of the sake for the law. For instance, just because a person is nice and assists another in time of need does not give the action any moral worth. An example of moral worth would be if the person is not inclined to give to others in time of need, but does so because of respect for the dictum that one should help their neighbor. So, what is the duty that should motivate us to do the right thing? Well, first we have to look at something called the hypothetical imperative. The hypothetical imperative is that the ends justify the means. In other words, I do something in order to get something in return. I may steal food from the neighborhood jewel just because my family is starving. Kant says we should not use the hypothetical imperative because it treats people as a means to an end. Rather, we should use the categorical imperative, which is act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. This means that any action you take should be able to be done by everyone in the same situation. We would not want to will that anyone could just steal because of their circumstance, because then everyone may steal and the society would break down. Now I have another YouTube video for you to watch, which talks about the basics of deontology, and it may give you a little more insight into this ethical stance. Well, we have to see how we're going to resolve the case using deontological ethics. Since it is the most basic duty of nurses and physicians to save a life, Martha must remain with the baby. However, there are problems with duty-based ethics. Duty-based frameworks are often versions of the divine command theory, which maintain that basic duties have their source in the will of God. But how are we to know the will of God? Furthermore, if we could find a satisfactory account of the content and basic duties, the framework may not be comprehensive or consistent. If a set of basic duties is comprehensive with the complexity of life, situations will arise in which the duties will conflict, and therefore the framework would be inconsistent. If the inconsistencies are eliminated, then the framework would have to eliminate certain duties, and it would be less comprehensive. And at times, duty-based ethics appears heartless and cruel, because there will be instances where fulfilling a duty will cause much pain and suffering. And as nurses, I'm quite sure that you have seen this when going in to do CPR on a 90-year-old gentleman who is riddled with cancer, seems only to prolong his suffering because of a duty to maintain life. Furthermore, duty-based ethics presupposes a widely shared conception of what is good for people and is more applicable to small homogeneous communities than the global society in which we now live. Well, now we're going to look at John Rawls' A Theory of Justice. I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. John Rawls was born in Baltimore, Maryland, to William Lee Rawls, one of the most prominent attorneys in Baltimore, and Anna Abel Stump Rawls. The second of 5 sons, tragedy struck Rawls at a young age. 2 of his brothers died in childhood because they contracted fatal illnesses from him. In 1928, the 7-year-old Rawls contracted diphtheria. His brother Bobby, younger by 20 months, visited him in his room and was fatally infected. The next winter, Rawls contracted pneumonia. Another younger brother, Tommy, caught the illness from him and died. Rawls' biographer, Thomas Pogue, calls the loss of the brothers the most prominent events in John's childhood. Rawls attended schools in Baltimore for a short time before transferring to Kent School, an Episcopalian preparatory school in Connecticut. Upon graduation in 1939, Rawls attended Princeton University, graduating summa cum laude, and was accepted into the Ivy Club and the American Whig Cliosophic Society. During his last 2 years at Princeton, he became deeply concerned with theology and its doctrines. He considered attending a seminary to study for the Episcopal priesthood. In 1943, he completed his Bachelor of Arts degree and immediately enlisted in the Army. During World War II, Rawls served as an infantryman in the Pacific, where he toured New Guinea, the Philippines, and occupied Japan. There, he witnessed the aftermath of the bombing of Hiroshima. After this experience, Rawls turned down an offer to become an officer and left the Army as a private in 1946. Shortly thereafter, he returned to Princeton to pursue a doctorate in moral philosophy. Rawls married Margaret Fox, a Brown University graduate, in 1949. After earning his Ph.D. from Princeton in 1950, Rawls taught there until 1952, when he received a Fulbright Fellowship to Oxford University, where he was influenced by a liberal political theorist and historian, Isaiah Berlin, and the legal theorist, H.L.A. Hart. After returning to the United States, he served first as an assistant, then associate professor at Cornell. In 1962, he became a full professor of philosophy at Cornell and soon achieved a tenured position at MIT. That same year, he moved to Harvard University, where he taught for almost 40 years. Rawls seldom gave interviews, and having both a stutter and a bat-like horror of the limelight, did not become a public intellectual despite his fame. He instead remained committed mainly to his academic and family life. On his religious views, Rawls was an atheist. In 1995, he suffered the first of several strokes, severely impeding his ability to continue work. He was nevertheless able to complete a book entitled The Laws of Peoples, the most complete statement of his views on international justice, and shortly before his death in November of 2002, he published Justice as Fairness, a restatement, a response to the criticisms of A Theory of Justice, which is the work that we're going to consider. In A Theory of Justice, Rawls is primarily concerned with defining the principles that would regulate an ideal society rather than describing how justice can be returned to an unjust society. The starting point from which a just society is to be built is when everyone is under a, quote, veil of ignorance. This veil of ignorance, while setting up a new society, facilitates the determination of the most equal laws, since no one would know their position in life, and thus may be the recipient themselves of a law that would put them in a bad position. For example, under the veil of ignorance, one would not make tax laws that gave an advantage only to the wealthy over the poor, because one would not know the economic position of their own lives, and they could end up being the poor ones. So Rawls had two principles. The first principle is the principle of greatest equal liberty, in which every member of a society has equal basic rights, such as freedom of religion and the pursuit of happiness. The second principle is that of fair and equal opportunity. In other words, the playing field should be equal. Example, all children should have a good education. That's the first part of the second principle. The second part of the second principle is the difference principle. If one uses their education to obtain wealth, it is fair, since the playing field was equal, and the person used the education offered to benefit himself or herself. However, it cannot disadvantage the less well off. Now, I want you to look at this YouTube video, which will give you a little bit more insight into Rawls' theory of justice. Well, we have to resolve the case using a theory of justice, and using it, the parents have a right to be supported, the baby has a right to life, the doctor has a right to the best assistant, and the new RN has a right not to be abandoned. Therefore, the most basic right is the right to life, and Martha should stay with the baby. Well, there are problems with justice as fairness. It's kind of like the deontological ethics, where we don't have a comprehensive list of basic rights, and at times respecting one person's basic right will cause another's to undergo much suffering and unhappiness. For example, the parents versus the baby. Well, now we're going to look at something completely different. And it's kind of a prelude to our next lecture, which will be on the ethics of care. And it is a text written by Carol Gilligan called In a Different Voice. In 1982, Carol Gilligan published In a Different Voice, Psychological Theory in Women's Development, which analyzed the psychological development of women and men and concluded that the two genders grow up speaking in different voices. She came to be known as the founder of difference feminism, asserting that women have differing moral and psychological tendencies than men. According to Gilligan, men think in terms of rules and justice, and women are more inclined to think in terms of caring and relationships. She asked that Western society begin to value both equally. Harvard University Press, which reissued the book in 1993, described it as the little book that started a revolution. As for virtually the first time in the social sciences, women's voices were heard in their own right. Some critics credit Gilligan with the forming of the basis for future works such as John Gray's Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. In a Different Voice was translated into 17 languages and today continues to inspire political debate, new research, and initiatives in policy and education. Carol Gilligan is now a professor at New York University, as well as chair of the advisory committee for the Center for Gender and Education at Harvard. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about her work. She looked at how people make decisions about morality. Gilligan found that men and women use fundamentally different approaches. And since men have dominated the discussion of moral theory, now just think, we looked at John Stuart Mill, we looked at Immanuel Kant, and we looked at John Rawls, all of whom are men. She said that women's perspective is often not taken seriously and is considered to be less developed and sophisticated. She said the male approach to morality is that individuals have certain basic rights and that you have to respect the rights of others. So morality imposes restrictions on what you can do. The female approach to morality is that people have responsibilities toward others. So morality is an imperative to care for others. Gilligan summarizes this by saying that a male morality has a justice orientation and that a female morality has a responsibility orientation. And she outlined 3 stages in moral development for females. The first is a selfish stage, the second is a belief in conventional morality, and the third is post-conventional. And there is a progression from selfish to social to principled morality. Female children start out with a selfish orientation. Then they learn to care for others, and that selfishness is wrong. So in their second conventional stage, when women typically feel it is wrong to act in their own interests and that they should value instead the interests of others. They equate concern for themselves with selfishness, and some women are kind of stuck in that mode. In the third post-conventional stage, they learn that it is just as wrong to ignore their own interests as it is to ignore the interests of others. One way to this understanding comes through their concern with connecting with others. A connection or relationship involves 2 people. And if either one is slighted, it harms the relationship. Well, this kind of sets the stage for the ethics of care, which we're going to be discussing in Ethics Part 2. Now I want you to go onto the web and look what Carol Gilligan actually said on women and moral development. Now we have to resolve the case using the ethics of care. And in my opinion, Martha would just ask the parents what they wanted, since both the parents and the child are the ones who are in the dilemma. And the problems with the ethics of care is what we're going to be discussing in next week's lecture.